Okay, good morning, everybody. Today is October 27th. I do need to bring something up very quickly. I want to apologize. Thursday's lecture, I didn't click the right button in Canvas, and I thought I did. And so if you're wondering where was Thursday's lecture, whoops, I'm really sorry about that. But it is posted now, so go into Module 4 and check it out. Now, of course, Quiz 4 has already passed, but nonetheless, remember, we're still going to have Exam 2, and so I still would like you to go in and watch that lecture for that reason. Now, this is a kind of a short lecture today. We watched a little film in class, and that film is called Voices for Union. It involves Andrew Jackson, James K. Polk, and Andrew Johnson, and I hope you'll go on YouTube and do it. Again, Voices for Union on YouTube. I posted it, and it's part of a project that I actually worked on in the 90s, and so if you want to watch that little video, I hope you will. So this will be a little bit shorter than most days, but we still need to talk a little bit about the material. What I want to do, if I can, is finish up the discussion of slavery. And although I know this is Module 4 material, we didn't finish it last time, and I just really don't think that we can, move on to Module 5 without having a discussion of this in our lectures, because this is going to lead to the Civil War. This is going to have such a defining impact on how our nation is moving forward. So I just want to finish this up. When we left off, I believe we were talking about slavery, and we had discussed plantations. Is that correct? Yes. Hold on just a minute. That roughly 50% of all slaves lived on what we would call a plantation. Roughly 50% lived with small families, yeoman farmers, and the like. Slavery was more common in the Deep South than it was in the Upper South, but it was still pretty common everywhere. And there are different roles to play on a plantation itself. We spent some time on that. There are the field hands, which are the vast majority of the slave labor. Most are going to fall into that category, but there are also house servants, if you will, a handful of them. There are skilled craftsmen like carpenters and blacksmiths that are particularly valuable and particularly important. There are also people on a plantation like the overseer, and it's his job to make sure that the work gets done, and the owner of the plantation, the master, if you will, he manages the books. He also gets to keep all of the money and isn't out there working, doing the actual work. The wife of the owner is the plantation mistress, and she has a role to play. She educates her children and oversees domestic issues. And this is important because she has to find suitable husbands for her daughters and all of that. And above all else, this is a business. This is a corporation. We gotta make money. That's why these plantations exist. There are plenty of plantation owners that are absentee. They don't actually live on the plantation. They are simply investors, but they live elsewhere. President James K. Polk, who we'll talk about, fell into that category. He and his wife lived in Nashville, but they had a very large plantation in Mississippi that he rarely even visited. It was just his job to make the money off of it, but he did the business part of it from his home in Nashville. So that would be the case as well. Now, let's talk about slave culture itself, because a very unique African-American culture will emerge from this. And needless to say, it reflects being held involuntarily in bondage. These are certainly people that understand that they are being exploited. They understand that their freedom is being stolen from them. And they also understand that they don't have legal rights, and their ability to push back against the system is very limited. And so their culture is going to reflect this. For example, they learn how to navigate by presenting one image when the white people are around, but then being more honest among themselves when white people aren't. They know we're safe to be ourselves, or, we have to pretend to be what the white people want us to be. And so having that sort of dual nature of their personalities was something that had to be understood if they were going to make it. They also would find ways to passively resist. In slave-holding plantations or on farms where there were slaves, tools tended to get broken an awful lot more frequently. It seems like every time you turn around, some sort of farm implement breaks one way or the other, and we can see what's going on there. There were other forms of passive resistance. For example, feigning illness, I'm too sick, that sort of thing. And a lot of times the whites understand what's going on here. It's not that the white people are too dumb to know this guy's really just pretending to be sick, or, that shovel got broken on purpose, but they kind of see it as a cost of doing business. They understand that there has to be a little bit of an outlet to resist, or else worse things can happen. Obviously, the ultimate fear that is going to be instilled in these families, and this is something that they are all very aware of and made aware of, is that they can be separated through sale. We can sell off your children, we can sell off your wife. If you really give us trouble, your family will be divided. This was not especially common. There's debate over this, but most historians agree that slaves rarely had their families broken up through sale. Importantly, though, it did happen, and everybody knows that it can happen. And so one of the reasons why it was uncommon is because of just simply the fear of it taking place. In the 1840s, there was a man by the name of Solomon Northup. And he was a free black living in New York. He was literate, he was a musician, and he was kidnapped and sold into slavery in the South. And this is something that happened. It wasn't common, but every free black has a price on their head. You know that. If you were to be kidnapped and sold into a slave territory, somebody will make a profit off of this, and you have no legal recourse. And so this was a real fear. And it happened to Northup. And of course, he tried to protest. He brought this up to the man that had purchased him and said, hey, I'm not really a slave here. I'm not supposed to be. I was kidnapped. But of course, this guy had paid a lot of money for him, so he didn't want to hear it. Eventually, after being sold a few times, he ended up in Louisiana, and I'm moving fast here. He was able to get a message, he was able to get a letter mailed to his friends in New York. And the state of New York actually had an office that investigated blacks that had been kidnapped in the state and sold in the South. And they would actually hire lawyers and go down to the South to try to free them. So, clearly this was an issue if the state of New York is getting involved. And after 12 years, Solomon Northup was freed, and he was sent back home. And he would publish a book called 12 Years a Slave. And in this book, he chronicles his experiences. Because in a sense, if you think about it, he's kind of in a very unique position to observe slavery from the inside. And of course, this guy doesn't like slavery. And of course, he talks about the abuses and whippings and, mothers losing their children, things like that. He points out, yeah, this happens. It might not be common, but it definitely takes place. And when it does, there's nothing anybody can do about it. It's just part of the way this system is so cruel. What he also notes, though, is that it isn't an entirely one-sided situation. He said that there's also many situations where slaves felt very well about their masters. There's genuine love and genuine affection and genuine friendships and genuine bonding that also takes place. That everybody kind of has their own way of looking at it. And the takeaway from that book is that at the end of the day, humans are going to be humans. Humans are going to be who we are. And if you live with somebody, if you're around somebody, if you have a important part of your life connected to somebody else, well, you're going to end up being human about it. And that means that you very well might develop very positive relationships. You might develop very real love. One point that's very unique here is that on plantations, slave women were often used as nurses and even wet nurses for the white children. The nanny, if you will, was often chosen among the slaves. And so black women were raising white children from infancy. Black women were raising white children from infancy. And this was a common thing. This was a common thing. That's where the term mammy comes from. And it's certainly not a politically correct term, but we need to know what it is. And it was a term that would be used to describe the black woman, often a slave, that was chosen to rear these little toddlers. Well, frequently these black women would have very loving connections to the children that they helped raise. And the reason is because, there's that instinct there. Women love children. And if you help raise a child, if you played a very role in their lives when they were toddlers, it's kind of hard not to like them. And so it's a really weird headspace that we're putting people into. It ultimately it's a form of emotional entrapment, if you will, because you're put in a situation that is very much unnatural and natural at the same time. And it wasn't good. Anyway, let's move on. Let's talk very briefly about the religion. I don't need to tell you that everybody is expected to be a Christian. The slave population would practice religion with whites, and they would, of course, have their own version when the whites weren't around. And they had preachers among them, and the way in which they worshiped was often very, very different. Whenever they're worshiping together among themselves, they are worshiping in a very different way than when they are sitting in church with their masters. And I don't need to tell you that the book of Exodus and the story of Moses leading the slave Hebrews out of Egypt was easily the most popular story. That was the one story that every single black person knew, particularly those that were enslaved. And you can figure out why that was such an important part of this. The Bible says the slaves are supposed to be freed. There's probably no more powerful story in all of Scripture than the story of Moses, parting the Red Sea and leading the Hebrews away from Pharaoh. And in the modern context, it's pretty clear who the Hebrews were, and it's pretty clear who Pharaoh is, and everybody knows it. What about resistance? Well, we've already mentioned minor resistance, tools getting broken, feigning illness, stuff like that. Now, there are more significant forms of resistance that are worth discussing, one of which is running away. Frequently, runaways were not trying to run away permanently. It was more like they were going on strike. A group of them would just get really angry at how they were being treated, and so they would all just sort of go into the woods and refuse to come back until they were given a better deal. And although clearly, the repercussions for something like this might be considered severe, oftentimes, again, it was just simply seen as part of doing business. If you run a plantation, if it's your job to make money on this plantation, you don't want to cause problems. Let's get everybody back to work. Let's negotiate with them. Let's give them better conditions or whatever. And so there was always kind of a back and forth. There was always a type of negotiation going on. In a few instances, of course, runaways were attempting permanent emancipation or permanent freedom. Generally, this was in the upper South along the northern border, because the idea is to get out of the slave territory as fast as possible. And for the most part, the goal was to make it to Canada. Because if you escape into a northern state, there's certainly a good chance that you will be brought back home. You are not free if you make it to a northern state. The Constitution even makes that clear. So you're not safe by making it into Ohio or Pennsylvania, even if the people there don't like slavery. Canada is where you are truly free. And there were communities in Canada of escaped slaves. So it was a thing. The reality is very, very few slaves actually did this. On the eve of the Civil War, there were roughly 3.5 million slaves in the slave states. And in any given year, less than 100 would probably seek permanent freedom by running away. It was a tiny percentage of the population. Nevertheless, it was a very visual element of slavery. It was something that the South was extremely sensitive about and something that everybody knew existed. And we've all heard of the Underground Railway, right? Everybody's heard of this sort of network of safe houses and places where escaped slaves could go. And of course, who is the one person that led people to freedom on the Underground Railway? Grandma Moses, who is she? Harriet Tubman, yes, of course. Harriet Tubman is the best known person who worked on the Underground Railway. Very briefly, Harriet Tubman was from Maryland, and she was born a slave in Maryland. She did escape, but then she returned to Maryland many times to guide more people out. And so even though she could have gone to Canada and been fine, she kept returning to bring more out. And of course, Harriet Tubman was known for her just absolute tenacity. She was tough. She was no nonsense. She did not play around. She wasn't afraid of anybody. And in the 1850s, she was the most wanted person in America. As much as we would see her as a hero today, obviously in the South, she is a criminal. And so if we have a 10 most wanted list, we would put Harriet Tubman on the top of it during that era for obvious reasons. And so obviously the hero is not always somebody who was seen as a hero at the time. And just to let you know, Harriet Tubman lived all the way into the 20th century. She actually served as a scout during the Civil War. During the Civil War, with a price on her head, she joined the Union Army and went into the South and helped guide Union soldiers. It's just absolutely nuts how tough this woman was. But there were others as well. She's just the one who is best known. Pneumonia? Oh, yeah, people would get sick in all kinds of ways, yeah. Yeah, as a matter of fact, more than pneumonia, yellow fever was particularly bad because, areas where it gets hot during the summer, you get a lot of mosquitoes. And so disease was real common. She was real old. She was like in her 90s when she died, something like that. So she might have died of pneumonia, but it was probably more of just, natural causes, old age. Yeah. Yeah. And then, again, there's pictures of her. I don't know if there's any video of her. I don't know if she was ever actually filmed, but there's plenty of pictures of her as an older woman. I think she moved to New York. I think she lived in New York and remained active her whole life in causes she believed in. Anyway, there are, of course, plenty of laws in place that prevent literacy. Slaves can't have possession of alcohol. Obviously, they can't have possession of guns, et cetera, et cetera. There were slave patrols that would occasionally go around from farm to farm and inspect slave cabins. And the slaves called these guys paddy rollers. And everybody hated them because they were generally low-class whites who would get drunk and just go be a bunch of jerks. Frequently, the whites would not let them on their farms either. What about free blacks? What about blacks that live in slave states but are not themselves slaves? Well, they were a small percentage of the population, but they did exist. They tended to live in urban areas, cities. Typically, they would be skilled craftsmen. They would work as carpenters and blacksmiths and things like that. Oftentimes they hired themselves out. They would go to plantations to do what it is they do and get paid for it. Now, keep in mind, all of the rules that apply to slaves pretty much apply to them too. They really have to watch themselves, because being free doesn't mean that they are citizens, and it doesn't mean that they are entirely respected. You get the idea. And of course, there's an awful lot of suspicion simply because their existence as a non-slave kind of gets the idea that we don't all have to be slaves. A free black in a slave state shows that, there is another way. And so there's a lot of mistrust. They're always worried about kidnapping. Frequently, the men, free black men, would marry slave women and then buy the freedom of their wives. They would make an arrangement to purchase their wife legally so then they could be part of a free family. And actually, if you look at census rolls, because everything has to be legal and by the book, we would see black men being the slave owners of black women. But that's actually not what's going on. That's a husband and wife, but it's just for legal purposes. He is listed as her owner rather than her husband. What about revolts? What about genuine armed resistance? Well, it never really happened except once. It never really happened except once. Now, there were a few instances where revolts almost took place during the colonial era. In that video that we saw, I talked about the Stono Rebellion, which took place in, I believe, 1721, something like that. There were a couple of plots that were uncovered during the antebellum era, but they never went anywhere. They never actually got off the ground. Now, there's a lot of reasons why we can assume that armed resistance, violent resistance didn't take place. You got to keep in mind that its ability to succeed is virtually non-existent, and they know this. They are outnumbered, and armed resistance, you're going to go down fighting, but you're still going to go down. And everybody knows this. And you got to keep in mind, if you're married, if you have a family, that's going to change your perspective on a lot of things. There's also the notion that almost certainly if an armed rebellion takes place, if violent resistance takes place, the repercussions are going to go well beyond the people that actually fought back. If you knew about it, you're getting hung too. If you were even around them, if you could even be remotely tied to this, you're probably going to end up being severely punished as well. And so any hint that we're going to revolt, the others are going to turn you in, which is, again, it's a terrible position to put someone in. Again, it reveals the very complex and cruel headspace slavery puts you in. But if you're a married man and you have a family and you want to see your children have a shot at freedom, and some guy over here is talking about, killing old master, you're going to turn him in because you're going to be next. They're not going to believe you when you say I didn't have anything to do with it. And so it was not that common. Now, it is worth noting in the Caribbean, armed, violent rebellion was very common. There were bloody, brutal slave revolts that took place all the time in the Caribbean. But throw in a wife, throw in a family, et cetera, and the dynamics change. All of this is going to come to a head in 1831 because we will see one revolt, and man, this is going to be a big one. It's going to change everything, and it is the Nat Turner Revolt. It is the Nat Turner Revolt. Nat Turner was a Virginia slave and he was a preacher. Keep in mind, slave preachers were still slaves. They were still field hands or whatever. And on August 20th, 1831, something just snapped. Up to that point, Nat Turner had not been a troublemaker. He had not been a rebel or given his owners any trouble whatsoever. He had been seen as a perfectly good, docile, obedient slave. He did not have anything in his personality that would indicate revolt. But on August 20th, 1831, he just changed. He claimed to have a vision from God where he was told to just kill every white person he could find. Just kill them all. He murdered his master. Immediately, the other blacks on the plantation rose up, and within hours, 60 of them had gathered up weapons and tools and whatnot and started going from farm to farm, just killing every white person, men, women, children, you name it. Over the course of a couple of days, 55 whites were killed. And again, it was everybody. Now, immediately the local militia mustered, the rebellion was put down. Many of them were shot and killed when it was put down, but 40 of the rebels were put on trial and executed, including Nat Turner. He was not killed in the suppression of the revolt. And during Nat Turner's trial, he expressed absolutely no remorse at all. God told me to kill all you white people, and if you don't hang me, I'm going to keep doing it. Not only did he express no remorse, he didn't, beg for his life. He didn't plead not guilty. He was unchanged in any way. Now, I want you guys to put yourself in the mindset of 1831 and Nat Turner. The idea that slaves would violently revolt is not hard to sort out. Yeah, that makes sense. We're the way we're treating these people, that kind of makes sense. But think about this one for a minute. Nat Turner was a good slave. He was not a bad guy at all. Nothing about his personality indicated that he was going to snap and do this. And you'll notice the minute he did, dozens joined him just like that, right? It took him no time to have an entire group that were willing to slaughter whites. So what the whites have to sort out is this idea that if Nat Turner can do it, any of them can do it. And the minute we turn our back, they will put a knife in it. The idea that they are accepting of their condition as slaves and that they really are friendly and that they really are understanding, and it is all an act. Every one of them wants us dead is basically kind of the fear that these whites have. What's interesting is that there was very little press coverage of the Nat Turner Rebellion. If you look at the newspapers at the time, throughout the slave states, the newspapers did not really hardly discuss this at all. Why would the newspapers not cover what is obviously an enormous news story? Why wouldn't they say there's been a slave revolt in Virginia? Yeah, it might cause a ripple effect, right? Hey, guess what? Slaves can read. There's a few of them that can, right? And the minute they realize, some of our brothers have risen up in Virginia, who knows what might happen next? And so instead of it being a media event, it was a media lockdown. It was a media lockdown. In the North, the newspapers covered it left and right. But in the South, man, the last thing we want to do is give them the idea. That's the logic. Show you a few pictures from this era. Here is here's a picture of of an auction house. This was in Washington, D.C. And actually, the building is still there. You can go to that building today. Today, it's a museum. But that building is actually still there. You know, yes, we really did this. And of course, we would see advertising in newspapers. You know, again, this is a commodity. This is a business. Let me see, what else do I have? Here is another slave auction. Again, you know, we know how it worked, but there you go. You know, they're put on the auction block. People show up. They are inspected. They are, you know, bought and sold. Here is another connection to the slave trade. Cotton merchants, you know, are involved in this. This isn't just, you know, the white slave owners that, oh goodness, we're out of time, aren't we? Okay, let's just show the pictures real quick. I'm sorry. Remember, everybody's tied into this. Here's a real interesting one to show that everybody's tied into it. Insurance. You know, if you are a slave owner, these are investments. And so there's insurance companies that will actually hold premiums, life insurance. And so, you know, again, it's not something people would think about. And of course, there are actual pictures. You know, you've probably, you know, seen these before, but, you know, again, men, women, children, old, young, you know, there you go. Right? And of course, we have more pictures that I can find. Here are some surviving cabins. Everybody knows what the cabins were, and some of them have survived, so that's good that you can see them. Here is 12 Years a Slave, Solomon Northup. This is a first copy of Northup's book. He published it in 1853. It was a huge bestseller, really, really interesting. And it was made into an Oscar-winning movie. You know, it won Best Picture in 2012. And the story had largely been forgotten. I mean, it's a fascinating story. And I've got an even better story that I want to talk about this year of a guy that ended up in Cuba as a slave, which is an even crazier story. Here is an image from 12 Years a Slave, you know, whippings and beatings. Not common, but the whole point is that if you see this happen to somebody, you're going to start playing by the rules. You do not want to be that guy. You know, this is a psychological tool. And yes, you know, there you go, right? You know, when you look, and this is probably the most famous picture that deals with whippings. What you have to understand is that this guy did not endure a lifetime of whipping as a slave. This guy was whipped once. All right, this is one time. See, and so when we say that they made an example out of you, they're not kidding. You know, they're not kidding. This is a one-time incident. And this guy was actually a runaway in Louisiana during the Civil War. His actual story is kind of fascinating. Everybody knows who this is. And I mean, she's just stared. She's daring you to make her mad. Is what she's doing. You know, she's looking at you and saying, "Yeah, bring it on." And then, of course, runaways. You know, advertised in newspapers. You know, advertising. You know, this describing them, et cetera, et cetera. And then, of course, you know, the North did cover the Nat Turner Rebellion. You know, the North wasn't playing around. They were willing to show it. What is the master's house called? What the slaves called master's house? The big house, yeah. And there's some big houses. And again, I know y'all got to go, but the two down below are in Natchez. Those are plantation houses. The one up above is actually Arlington House. Arlington Cemetery in Washington, D.C. was a big house. You know, the cemetery itself was a plantation, and then Arlington House is the house on the hill. So Arlington Cemetery is a former plantation, and the man that lived in that house was Robert E. Lee. And here's a big house. What's that? That's a mile from here. That's Beauvoir. And it was, of course, you know, Beauvoir was a slave plantation. That's what it was. The family that built this actually had multiple plantations. This was their summer home. But, you know, right over here, about a mile up the road, there's Jeff Davis's home.
Whoa, what? Oh, heard.
Yeah, Beauvoir. Yeah, right up the street. That's a picture of it. Yeah. And, that's the North factories, yeah. Yeah, don't worry. There's slaves in the North, too. Just a very different version, right? You know, somebody's got to do the work, I guess. All right, look, everybody go. I'm sorry I kept y'all over. Y'all take care.